Shelley gets political again with Ozymandias, a sonnet from 1817 or so, the product of another writing competition with a friend of his on a similar subject. Yeah, guys. It's an interesting little poem, and it's a little bit more subversive and complicated, really, than at first glance. There's an awful lot going on there. There's a lot of fairly standard Shelley-esque, hokiness, quite frankly. But there's some distinct attributes to it that make it more than it appears. It is a fun poem, and it's one of his more famous because it's so iconic in a lot of dramatic ways. Yeah, what do you Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." It's catchy, it's interesting, but it's more interesting, I would say, than it's catchy, because as dramatic as it is, the idea of it, it's got an awful lot going on there that stamps it as a romantic poem, stamps it as a Shelley poem, but stamps it as something curious beyond those categories. For one thing, Ozymandias. The name is essentially an alternate name for the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II. This is a problematic issue for some. If your critical stance is considering Orientalism. This is at the point of the early 1800s. The British Empire is fanning out across the globe and bringing in vast swaths of archaeological and cultural treasures, let's say, and often just appropriating them without the consent of the governing bodies around there. In this case, Egypt. They were going through Egypt like crazy, digging up stuff, all in the name of science, and that's a fair debate. But bringing it back and putting it in the British Museum and studying it on their terms, the British terms. You can go a couple of different ways with that, but the image of a British poet appropriating a symbol of Egypt, and a symbol of an Egypt that has fallen, that's problematic for some. You go with that wherever you like. Ozymandias, he's choosing that it's a real person. It's an association with a real historical figure. We don't know that much about him, but it gives a certain verisimilitude to it, a certain credibility to it. Like, oh, okay, this is just another archaeological find. And in fact, there's you can read footnotes about the link to the actual figure of it and the statue or whatever. But just as a poem, Ozymandias is interesting. Just using the name. Think about it. Well, if they had gone with Ramses is, it's a fine name. It might have been a little confused with the Ramses of the Moses story and be too associative with that. So, how do you differentiate? But also Ramses is just, kind of a two-syllable dead thing, but Ozymandias is automatically it's automatically a meter. It is naturally what is oh God, I'm blanking on the word, but it just falls into the ba-dum meter. I'll think of it in a minute. I don't care. It is a sonnet. This is a sonnet. This is a very formal British thing at this point. It has all the qualities of traditional sonnets, the 14 meters, the meter, or the 14 lines, the meter, but it breaks because Shelley's always got to be a little iconoclastic. It breaks from the Petrarchan model, and it breaks from the British model, and it's a little idiosyncratic in its rhyme scheme and the meter and structure really at the time. So it's the image also that it starts off with, very dramatic first line. I met a traveler from an antique land, and automatically you're sort of transported back to Coleridge and the Ancient Mariner, and the idea of somebody coming up to you and saying, "I have something to tell you." And it's an antique land. So there you see the romantic preoccupation with that which is old, that which is ancient in different ways, that which is somehow exotic. Beyond the distance of it in distance from London of the early 19th century to Egypt, but also the distance in time from London of the 19th century to ancient civilization, to ancient Egypt. We're talking hundreds of years BCE. That sense of something almost primal coming back, something more timeless. I met a traveler. Traveler's always very big. Somebody who's out there drifting around, perhaps somewhat rootless. It's very romantic. Who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs." Now, just think about that. This statue is immediately imaged as legs standing in the desert. Which is an interesting thing. And as you read on and you realize, okay, this is the statue of a pharaoh, of a king. The legs are still standing on the civilization. The civilization is literally underfoot of this giant figure, which is an interesting little imagination of the role of the monarch. Or the position of the monarch, because here we see Shelley's great antipathy towards tyrants of all sorts, monarchs of all sorts. Near them on the stand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. The face, the head of the statue is basically buried in the sand. It's not hard to see the symbolism there. The monarch with the head buried in the sand can't really see anything, and just oblivious in general. But the image of the destroyed civilization is really the breathtaking part of this, and that contrast between the full-throated "I am Ozymandias," saying, look on my works and despair, and yet there's nothing around. It's all empty space. It's desert, desolate, empty. Everything he did in his life, everything he did in his reign is gone, and yet he is so boastfully declaring that as if it's going to stand forever. It doesn't. Now, of course, this is a political case, because Shelley is saying that, well, no matter how domineering your tyrant is, he is still just a tyrant, and he will fall. All tyrants fall, and this is him driving this point home. But also, he is elevating the artist over the king here. Which is another fairly traditional move, oddly, where the art survives. The only reason we know of this is Ozymandias' statue and the inscription on it. And so the art dinged up, certainly, but the part of it that's verbal significantly is the one that lasts, that is perhaps the most intact, and that is the pedestal. And that's where the words are, the words that are supposedly Ozymandias speaking. And so the art survives even after the tyrant falls. But there is a little bit of a problem there if you consider that, well, would we care about the art if it wasn't for the tyrant? Would the art even exist if it wasn't for the tyrant? And yet the tyrant is also remembered because of the art. And significantly, how many great figures of the ancient world survive to us largely through their representation in art? So it's a much knottier problem than maybe Shelley is even imagining here. Shelley seems to be saying, well, yeah, we'll survive and you'll be worm food. Yeah, but it's a little bit more symbiotic than that. I don't think, it's not like we have the artist himself here either. We're not celebrating the artist. He didn't sign this work. There's a certain interrelationship there that the poem is maybe glossing over, or maybe intentionally leaking. I'm not sure. It could be hinting out that, well, it's much more complicated than you might think. Interesting also is the number of voices in this poem. There are 3 different voices speaking in this fairly tight little sonnet. There is the poem's speaker, who just speaks that first line, which sets everything else in motion. Everything after that is filtered through the traveler. The quotation marks start on the second line and they end at the very bottom. So everything in between is the words of the traveler, including the third voice in that, which is Ozymandias himself, which is the statue and the inscription and his ability to speak directly to the reader. Those words are naturally ironized because it's set up as irony because, well, okay, he's saying, look on my works in despair, and everything is turned to dust. But the traveler himself is ironized, because how much can we really trust what he's saying? He is presenting this to us as another form of art. He is presenting the art of another artist. He is presenting the story of this statue, if you will. And so this is another complication. This is another wrinkle. This is another something that we're not sure exactly how to approach anything like an objective version of this. And then on top of that, this is all, again, through a somewhat conspicuous first person. I met a traveler from the foreign or ancient land. So it's coming to us through so many layers of art itself that we're right to be a little skeptical. It's like, well, now wait a minute. We're being told so much that we're at such a remove from anything like truth or the object itself that we're not sure how to take it. It is troubling. And so, reflecting back on the portrayal of Ozymandias himself, maybe all of that art, maybe that statue that we're told the face is sneering or growling or whatever, he sounds like a very unpleasant person in this statue, maybe that statue is also complicated. Maybe that statue is also a misrepresentation. We don't know. It's difficult, and whether or not whether or not it's intentional, I don't know. I don't even really care. I know that on these points, the poem is more complicated and sophisticated than just a superficial reading might at first suggest. It's driving towards a really sophisticated relationship between art and reality that we're just not that used to in a in poetry. The all the regular markers are there for romantic poets. Quite frankly, there's there is the heralding of the ancient. I met a traveler from an antique land. Antique meaning that perhaps the stuff from long ago will surpass what we have today. That somebody that old, that culture is still kind of with us in a fractured and archaic way, but perhaps that suggests that what we have today won't be. I'm not sure. It's hinting at a lot of different things here that I'm not entirely certain how to take. The nature of the sand. Sand is nature that is reclaiming, if you will, the work of art and the history and certainly the civilization. Nature as a kind of all-powerful force, almost godlike, but also somewhat threatening. It's not the pleasant lakeside nature of Wordsworth. It's a much more Old Testament nature, if you will. It is a kind of overwhelming force. Most of all, it is dramatic. There is this great sense of emotion swept up in it. The language is somewhat. The language is very well. The rhythm is very regular. The language is very simple and elemental, and it's playing on this kind of mystery of, yes, exoticism of the ancient era, exoticism of the Orient, the exoticism of power as well, quite frankly. And it's got a romantic feel to it, and that sense of the vastness of the desert that has just covered over everything. That is a wilderness that is awe-inspiring to imagine, especially to an English-speaking public who, they don't know about sand that much. You go down to the beach in England and it's pretty much all rocks. There's not that expanse that you can see in Egypt, which again troubles because it's the sense of the British Empire reaching out into ways that they can and bringing it back for the popular entertainment of the masses in green England. So there are all of these themes suffused through this poem that make it so much more complicated and rich than just the simple ditty that it sort of offers itself as, quite frankly. I think maybe this is me taking my own suspicions about Shelley and importing them too much into this poem. Maybe this is me rejecting the idea that it is so widely anthologized and it shows up in popular media from time to time, and it's just something that you memorize in grade school. Maybe that is me pushing back on this just a little bit. But the more I look at this poem, the more I see that it's not that simple. There is a simple aspect of it, and you can enjoy it for that. But there is an undercurrent that is way more fun to have access to.